Good evening, everyone. My name is Jim Cairns. I manage the UK and Ireland for Fibro Animal Health. First of all, I know everybody's busy. Therefore, I'd like to thank all of you for coming on to this webinar. In a world where dairy farming is becoming more efficient with new technologies and smarter nutritional techniques, cows are also offering higher yields. But unfortunately, no matter how good the farm management is and the knowledge of nutrition is, we still come across health challenges that continue to occur on farm, which therefore holds back your cows from achieving their full potential. Ensuring your cows are healthy is one of the fundamentals of successful dairy farming, in my view. Therefore, our idea behind this webinar is to talk about udder health, fertility as an open days, and as we're heading back into spring/summer, we'll touch on heat stress. We'll also discuss how feeding OmniGen on a daily basis to your cows helps to support their immune system, especially during expected and unexpected stress events. What is OmniGen? Most of you will know, some of you may not. It's a unique, patented nutritional speciality product from Fibro Animal Health. OmniGen is recommended to be fed to dry and lactating cows every day to help support healthy immune function in the face of expected and unexpected stress events. OmniGen is used by some of the best dairies in the world. It's estimated just now it's fed to over 2.5 million cows and growing. A little bit about Fibro in the UK and the EU. Fibro have been in the EU for around 11 years. That's 4 years in the UK and around 2 years in Ireland. Fibro's main products are Anistat, which is a highly palatable decaf product, and OmniGen, and we've just released a product called Rely On. Who is Dave Kirk? Dave Kirk leads the US dairy technical team for Fibro Animal Health. His team support our nutrition speciality products, including OmniGen, Animate, AB20 and Celery Yeast Solutions. Dave's expertise includes the focus on the feeding and management of transitional dairy cows, mineral nutrition, feeding formulation and manufacturing. Dave's got over 30 years experience in the feed industry, working primarily with dairy producers, feed manufacturers, nutritionists and veterinarians. Dave's received his Masters of Science in Nutrition from Texas A&M University, and also he has a PhD in Animal Science from Virginia Tech in the USA. Just some house rules. Everybody's mics and screens are off, therefore you can get any questions, you just click it on the chat, and at the end of the actual presentation, we'll do a Q&A session where I'll ask Dave the questions. And on that, I'll hand you over to Dave to start his presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Jim, can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me okay?
Yeah, you're fine.
Fantastic. Okay. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate you giving me a chance to visit with you this evening. It's afternoon here. I'm in Wisconsin in the lobby of a hotel, so hopefully it's not too noisy. We had a change in schedule. We had a little bit of real winter weather finally arrive here and had some flights that moved around. So I'm hoping that there's not a lot of background noise where I'm at right now. But I'm going to move right into it. Certainly, as advertised, we're going to be talking about keeping your cows healthy. But to be honest, I'm going to talk about keeping your house. Oops, locked up the thing. Keeping your cows healthy using OmniGen. You see OmniGen on the screen quite a bit here. We're going to be talking about OmniGen. Specifically, I'm going to share with you some controlled research results as well as some field study results that demonstrate the benefits of feeding OmniGen in regard to reducing mastitis risk, improving reproductive performance, specifically reducing days open, and also mitigating the impacts of heat stress. So that's what we're going to talk about here today. Appropriate for the theme of this presentation, keeping cows healthy, we're going to start with the impacts of OmniGen to reduce mastitis risk. And certainly, not just in the US and Europe, but around the world, mastitis is the most costly disease that affects dairy cattle. Here in the U.S., it causes significant losses for the economy, the dairy economy. Estimated cost of mastitis is $2 billion each year. Jim, you'd have to convert that to pounds for me. I'm not sure what that is, but I'm guessing it's a lot. When you start talking billion's a big number.
Yes, about 1.8 billion.
Okay. Yep. Thank you. Very specifically, an individual case of mastitis in first lactation animals, it costs about $325. In mature cows, it'd be at $425 per case. And certainly a lot of those losses are related to milk production loss, and that's one of the reasons why we have a higher loss with multiparous cows compared to first lactation animals. Mastitis will affect about 1/3 of the cows in the herd, and they're going to have that infection in one or more quarters when it does occur. And when we talk about preventing and managing mastitis, it really involves 3 areas. First is reduction, and here we're really talking about reducing the exposure of the Tiden to mastitic organisms or pathogens, and that's really through proper sanitation. For us, a really big focus is on clean and dry bedding and cow comfort, and trying to reduce the exposure of that Tiden to manure and the pathogens that are present or that grow in them. Second is to improve the resistance to infection, and here we're talking about supporting a healthy defense or healthy immune system to help combat the pathogens that are present. And in that case, this is where really OmniGen fits in, to helping to improve that resistance to infection. And finally is treatment, and that's the last resort, right? Where we, it's certainly here in the United States, we're mostly thinking about antibiotic treatment. And that's necessary in cases when we actually have a true infection in the animal. We do have to remove that animal from the milking string or the milk from the bulk tank, and we do have to at times use antibiotics. But we certainly want to reduce the need for that by improving resistance and reducing exposure to the pathogens. When we think about the risks associated or that related to mastitis, we really need to be considering the lactation cycle and where those risks occur, and really in considering our work to improve resistance to those events. So as you look at this lactation curve, certainly we look at periods when the animal is experiencing stress, and stress results in immune dysfunction, really immune suppression, and that's going to be primarily at calving, which is the most stressful event within a lactation cycle, and at dry off, which would be the second most stressful period. I'm sorry for the noise, but that's not coming through any. So again, when we're thinking about OmniGen is a product that protects the immune system from stressors and from the impacts of stress. And that's where one of the benefits are going to be seen. And that's what I mentioned when we think about expected and unexpected stress that the animals can experience. Well, the stress that occurs at dry off and at calving are expected. We know when those are going to occur really based upon when you get that animal pregnant. And that's something that we can keep in consideration as we look at our feeding programs and our strategies. But certainly stressors that occur anytime during the lactation cycle can lead to immune suppression and can benefit, the animal can benefit from the use of OmniGen. But certainly we can consider these very stressful events when we think about our strategies for both feeding and managing cows to help to prevent mastitis. So I thought I'd start by sharing with you guys just one controlled research study. And I picked one that was conducted in Europe. It was a study that was conducted in Italy at the University of Bologna, or by the University of Bologna. It was actually conducted on a commercial dairy in the Po Valley by Dr. Andrea Formigoni. He's very well known globally, excellent dairy researcher. But he had done a study really looking at the impacts of OmniGen on animal health and performance, and we're going to focus in on mastitis. But I'll give you the slide actually provides the experimental design of the study. In this study, animals were boxed according to a number of different factors so that they're relatively even in two groups. And one group was fed OmniGen from dry off through approximately 150 days in milk, and that's what this green line is supposed to represent. That was the OmniGen feeding period. And another group was fed the control diet without OmniGen through that same period. And during that period, animals were fed different diets and housed separately as a far off dry cows, close up dry cows, a fresh group, and then into lactation. When we look at the response and health of these animals, I'll just kind of describe the graph because sometimes it's confusing as we move from graph to graph. Here on the y-axis is the percentage incidence of diseases, and along the x-axis are different diseases. The blue bars are going to be the averages or means from the group that was fed the control diet. The green bar is going to be the averages or mean from the cows were fed the OmniGen supplemented diet. And we're going to focus on mastitis. That's a section that we're really interested in here today. But here you see really a nice trend, a statistically significant value of a p less than 0.1. We consider that a trend for a reduction in mastitis in animals that were fed OmniGen compared to those that was fed the control diet, decreasing from about 19% down to just over 10%. Significant drop in mastitis incidence when OmniGen was fed. Not surprisingly, based on that reduction in clinical mastitis, they also saw an overall improvement in milk quality. Again, describing the graph, the blue line is going to be the results in somatic cell count, linear score of somatic cell count in animals fed the control diet over the first 120 days in milk, shown on the x-axis. The green line is going to be the results in animals that were fed OmniGen. And certainly what we see here overall is a reduction in somatic cell count when OmniGen was fed compared to the control-fed animals, and a statistically significant difference with a p-value of 0.05 at 30 and 120 days. So consistent response that we saw a reduction in clinical mastitis when OmniGen was fed to these animals, and an overall improvement in milk quality as measured using linear score somatic cell when animals were fed OmniGen. We're not focused here on milk yield in this presentation, but not surprisingly, when these animals are healthier animals, less mastitis, improved milk quality, they're going to see an improvement in milk yield. Now here it wasn't statistically significant, but the color coding remains the same. Green line is the results in milk yield over the 150 days in milk when animals were fed OmniGen. The blue line is the results in milk yield when animals were fed the control diet. A nice numerical improvement in milk yield when OmniGen was fed. So that's a controlled research study with university supervision. And it's very consistent. We've had studies conducted in the United States and in other countries that would show similar responses. It's particularly in regard to mastitis. Animals fed OmniGen do have reduction in mastitis and improvement in milk quality. But we've also seen this in practical settings in commercial dairies as well. What I'll share with you here are results of, it was actually a sales program. It's our Immunity Challenge program, which was conducted in the United States for about 10 years. It's a pretty simple program. You simply compare the results in a herd of cows from a period in which OmniGen was fed, added to the diet, that period maybe 90 to 180 days, and compare that response with the same length of time prior to adding OmniGen to the diet. So in that case, we're comparing results within a herd. Within a herd, it's significant. They're interested in those results. It's what happens every herd does this to try new products or to look at the change in the diet to see what the response would be. Just a before and after. But when you combine 1,000 of those herds, which each herd serves as its own control, you can run some very interesting statistical analyses on that to determine if those differences might be consistent and be repeatable. And that's what was done with the Immunity Challenge program here in the United States. Again, just quickly, because I'm using a little different colors on some of these graphs to describe these, the y-axis is the percentage incidence of different diseases in fresh cows. The gray bar is going to be the results of from the period prior to feeding OmniGen. The blue bar is going to be the period after which OmniGen was, or during which OmniGen was being fed. Okay, and so let's look at mastitis because that's really our interest here. So you'll see in parentheses 133. It's kind of surprising, isn't it? We had 1,000 herds, but only 133 of those actually were collecting information in regard to mastitis incidents. But 133 is still a pretty large number. And when we look at the statistical analysis for each of these diseases that are included, including mastitis, we had a p-value less than 0.001. That's a very strong, significant difference, which indicates that these differences are real and are repeatable. You're gonna have confidence that you'd see a similar result if you were to repeat this on other dairies. So over here, they saw a nice, strong response, about a 15% reduction in mastitis incidence when animals were fed OmniGen compared to the period immediately prior during which OmniGen was not being fed. Okay, and we won't spend any time on the others, but you do see a very consistent response, about a 15 to 20% reduction in fresh cow diseases in animals when animals were fed OmniGen. This graph, it looks similar, but it's somatic cell count here, as you see on the y-axis. Overall, there was a reduction across herds in the 1,000 herds, approximately 1,000 herds that we looked at. And here, most herds were reporting somatic cell count because they get it from the milk plant. We saw a reduction in somatic cell count, about 35,000 cells per milliliter during the period in which OmniGen was fed compared to the immediate same length of time prior to feeding OmniGen. In this graph, we've actually segregated the responses by initial somatic cell count prior to feeding OmniGen. So here we have very clean herds, less than 200,000. Again, the gray is control, or the period prior to feeding OmniGen. The blue is the period when OmniGen was fed. You really don't see a difference. They're not, you wouldn't expect to see a difference here, right? They're pretty clean herds. But when we look at 200 to 300, 3 to 4, and greater than 400,000, you see that the period when OmniGen was fed, we saw a lower somatic cell count than in the herds prior to feeding OmniGen. And what's also interesting, and you see that as the initial somatic cell count is increased, the response to OmniGen, the difference from before to during OmniGen feeding, the difference becomes greater. And this is something that we see when we look at other health events in dairy herds when OmniGen is fed. And it's led us to the phrase that we often use: the greater the challenge, the greater the response to OmniGen. So we tend to see a stronger response to OmniGen in herds that might have a stronger or higher initial somatic cell count. I don't want to overstate that, because there are situations we're going to herd, there's very poor sanitation. You have dirty cows and you have very high somatic cell count. And there's multiple stressors that are present at a very significant level. In those cases, it can be overwhelming. It can overwhelm the response to OmniGen. So I'm not going to tell you it can go into some very, very bad herds with this phenomenal response. But we have seen in herds that are reasonable levels of stress and reasonable challenges in regard to somatic cell count. We do tend to see stronger responses that have higher initial somatic cell count. Okay. So this immunity challenge program was quite successful in the United States. It helped us sell OmniGen, to be honest, and it made for a very good story when we talked about the benefits of feeding OmniGen. And it was consistent with what was seen in commercial research projects that were done with OmniGen as well. The program was also conducted in Europe. And here I'm just showing as an introduction where we've done this work with 244 EU herds. Certainly we didn't have as much time with OmniGen in Europe as we had in the United States, and not nearly the number of folks in the field doing this work as we do in the US. But I think they really built a nice data set with the number of herds that they have. And as we look at mastitis, you can see we had 156 herds that did this same project in which they compared the response of mastitis incidents in herds before and during a period in which OmniGen was being fed. And you can see the regions where this was being done, and includes many of you guys here. So focusing in on mastitis from this immunity challenge in the European Union, Overall, what we found was a 28% reduction in mastitis incidence when OmniGen was fed compared to the same period of time prior to feeding OmniGen. And again, strongly significant difference. It gives you confidence that that's a response that's repeatable, and maybe it would be seen, heard in hers that you're working with today. Overall, when we look at the difference between, compare and contrast, I guess, the results of the US or North American immunity challenge program with the European immunity challenge program, actually this comparison looks a little bit farther back. It didn't include all 1,000 herds. We've done this immunity challenge summary a number of times in the US, but when we're comparing the previous review of the results, you see very similar trends or tendencies here. Let's focus on mastitis. In the US immunity challenge, overall, we saw a 17% reduction in mastitis incidence, a stronger response in the European immunity challenge program, reducing mastitis by 28%. Similarly, when we look at bulk tank, in this data set in the US, 32,000 cells per milliliter reduction in somatic cell, a little bit higher in the European immunity challenge. But I don't think it's important to look at the specifics, but if you look at the direction, certainly they're very, very similar, and it's a very strong response in both data sets. So I think this is a really nice work to show that the controlled research that we do, I showed just one example. We have many examples of controlled research showing the benefits of OmniGen to reduce mastitis. I showed one from Italy, but the results that we see in the field are very consistent, and they're also very consistent with our expectation based on the very, I'll call it basic research, the intensive research that we've done in the past to get a better understanding of the mechanism of action or how OmniGen works. These are the responses that we'd expect to see. And I think it's great to be able to see that the same responses can be found worldwide. We sell OmniGen around the world, and these cows are not so different, and the challenges that they face are not so different. So it's good to see that the responses to OmniGen are consistent worldwide. This slide is very interesting to me, to be honest. I'm not as familiar with this work. Jim, you may know much more about this than I do, but it's fascinating to me. This is work that's been done in the Netherlands, in which they really track antibiotic use, and certainly antibiotic use is. I'm going to use the word proxy. I'm not sure that's an accurate term to use, but you would expect that if you had less mastitis, you'd have lower antibiotic use. Here they use the records that are being kept by the Smetterloons organization that tracks antibiotic use in the Netherlands. It included results from 48 farms. And what they saw was a 28% reduction in the use of antibiotics during the 180 days during which OmniGen was fed, compared to the immediate prior period, 180 days before OmniGen was added to the diet. That's pretty significant, 29% reduction, almost a third less antibiotics. And this was just in the lactating cows. It did not include results for calves or dry cow treatments among those. So I apologize. I wish I knew more about this work. Jim, you may know more. You probably use this. To me, it's really strong support for the use of OmniGen to reduce antibiotic use.
Yeah, I know a bit about it. I'm sure it's a government-run organisation that all the vets have to make sure that any antibiotics they use is put into the system. So from a data collection point of view, it's really, really good, and it's really, really accurate.
Yeah, great. We don't have anything like this in the U.S., but I think it's really strong data to support the use of OmniGen. And certainly, we're talking about it for in relation to mastitis, but there's obviously other I think relationships that we can tie it to. Yeah,
I think from a fibro and a feed nutritionist point of view, I think we'd all love to have this style of system. We don't have it in the UK. We don't have it in Ireland.
Okay. So Jim, I'm gonna stop talking about mastitis there, but I thought it's kind of a break point. I don't know if there might be some things that you might want to mention at this point, or if there were any questions. I'm not sure if this is how you want to handle the questions. Guys, I apologize. We were supposed to get together here to walk through how we're going to do things, Jim and I, but I had a lot of trouble getting onto Zoom. So poor Jim was probably sweating, figuring, will Kirk even be able to get on this call?
Fine.
So
No, it's fine. And the presentation's been good so far.
Okay.
But I'd rather just leave the questions to the end. We'll do a Q&A
Okay.
on that.
Very good. Thank you. I'm going to shift then, Jim. We were talking about mastitis. Let's shift and talk about the impacts of feeding OmniGen on reproductive performance, and specifically days open, reducing days open, because that's what our research has indicated. And I'm going to start by giving a little bit of background information on the impacts of disease, particularly fresh cow diseases, on reproductive performance in dairy cows, because I think it's important to get a good understanding of that. I'm just going to go through two studies really quickly. Both were conducted using data from large dairy herds in Florida in the Southeast United States. Just a large data set with great data that was collected. And as you look at this graph, this is they call it a survival curve. And what you see on the y-axis here is the percentage of cows with a successful pregnancy, and on the x-axis, the days in milk, okay? And this was data from a total of about 4,000 cows. So it's a large data set. And you can use that. It's kind of a retrospective study. So they're looking backwards at the results to look at differences. And what you see here on the top line is going to be the results in pregnancy of animals that had no diseases within the first 21 days in milk. So essentially no fresh cow diseases. The dashed line here in the middle are going to be the results in regard to pregnancy of animals that had a single fresh cow disease prior to 21 days in milk. And finally, the dotted line is going to be the results in regard to pregnancy of animals had more than one fresh cow disease, okay? So what you can see is, pregnancy is reduced, certainly in animals that are sick as fresh cows, whether they have a single event or multiple events. Obviously, these fresh cows that are disease-free get bred back sooner, and to be honest, they stay pregnant. It's only shown here pregnancies, right? So it's a reflection primarily of conception. Conception as well. They used a program breeding, so ovulation and heat detection was pretty much under control. But you got more cows pregnant, and you got more cows to stay pregnant when they were healthy as fresh cows. And the stay pregnant part is important because this graph only shows whether or not they got pregnant. Did they stay pregnant? When you compare the results of animals with no fresh cow diseases to those that had one or more, so both in the single and multiple disease, 73% of cows carried a calf to term. They had a calf if they did not have any disease. If they had a disease, that was reduced all the way down to 58%. So a large loss. So some of that is because cows aren't getting pregnant. Some of that is because cows aren't staying pregnant. There's an increase in early embryonic death, as well as an increase in abortions in animals that were sick at 21 days. Isn't that amazing? The effects carry all the way over through the entire pregnancy. Now, as we compare animals that had a single disease versus multiple diseases, we also see differences. So certainly having multiple diseases will have a greater impact, not only in their ability to get pregnant, but to stay pregnant. We have definitely losses of those animals. Okay. So kind of a takeaway from this study was that fresh cow diseases, and in this case, it was diseases at less than 21 days after calving, fewer cows were inseminated, fewer cows became pregnant, so conception rate was reduced, and fewer cows calved, and that's a combination of both the first two as well as an increased loss of pregnancies, okay? There's another study. It kind of makes this point in a little stronger way, I think. In this case, it was a little bit larger data set, also from Florida, 5,000 cows, and they looked at the impacts of different disease types, and they looked at non-uterine diseases, shown here, mastitis, lameness, digestive disorders, and respiratory diseases, but all what would be considered inflammatory diseases. You get an inflammation response, right? And they looked at separately from those what they considered uterine diseases, retained placenta and metritis. Again, inflammatory diseases, but diseases that may be more directly related to reproductive performance. The results are fascinating. Let me walk through the graph here with you. The white bar is going to be animals with no disease. The second bar is going to be animals that had a non-uterine disease. prior to first AI service. Okay, this third bar is going to be animals that had a uterine disease prior to first AI service. And then the black bar is going to be those animals that had both a uterine and a non-uterine disease. The results are fascinating. So these are animals that were pregnant 45 days after their first AI service. And once again, healthy animals are more successful in getting pregnancy. This is a 40% conception rate, essentially, right? Where you see a reduction when these animals are diseased, whether it's a non-uterine or uterine disease, there's no difference. The effects of the combination of the two are additive. So it's worse to have both a uterine and a non-uterine, but they're both quite significant when you compare them with these animals without disease, okay? Here we look at calving, so actually carrying that pregnancy to term. Now the differences are even greater. Look at that, the spread, how it grows between the healthy animals and those animals that are quite sick with both uterine and non-uterine diseases. Where does that come from? Pregnancy loss. Look at how much fewer pregnancy losses you have in healthy animals compared to these sick animals, okay? And remember, again, this is shown here, this larger bar here for these combined uterine and non-uterine diseases show that they're an additive effect. So these diseases can have a big effect on these animals, on the reproductive performance. And it's not just right at AI service. You have more animals losing pregnancies than you have animals not getting pregnant. It's a big impact, and it's long lasting, which is the amazing thing to me. These uterine diseases and non-uterine diseases, these inflammatory diseases, have long-term impacts on the reproductive performance of dairy cattle. Right? And so the takeaways for them, again, it's long lasting, these inflammatory diseases, fresh cow diseases primarily. And in this particular study, we didn't have time to go through all the results, but they really dug down deep to get an understanding of why this is happening. And they found two reasons, okay? One, this loss of performance related to fresh cow diseases is related to damaged follicles, okay, that developing egg within that animal, and or impaired uterine environment. Two factors related to the presence of inflammatory diseases, primarily after calving, that have long-term impacts on reproductive performance: damaged follicles and an impaired uterine environment. It's really interesting. So keep that in the back of your mind as I walk through just a couple of studies, 3 total actually, that we've done with OmniGen. And I can tell you guys, I don't even like showing these. I got a mouse here talking about dairy cattle, and I feel like people are already smirking. But it's important to remember, reproductive research it takes a long time to do. Like the studies that I just showed you, they're retrospective. So they went in, there was a data set there, and they looked backwards. If you're going to do a controlled research study where you're feeding different diets or having different treatments, you got to track these animals through for a long period of time. And it takes a lot of cows because there's so many factors that impact reproductive performance. So there's a lot of variability. So it takes a lot of cows and it takes a long time. You know what that means? It takes a lot of money. So it's just good sense actually it seemed like good sense to us at Fibro to do studies with smaller animal models to see if we would even suspect that we see improvements in reproductive performance before investing in a long-term, large number herd of cows, a herd level study. So one we did with mice. Mice are cheap, and nobody feels too bad if they don't make it out of the study. So we did a study, we sponsored a study at Washington State University, and Washington is in the far northwest corner of the United States, and simply fed mice with or without OmniGen for a period of time, about 32 days, and then they induced them artificially induced them to have endometritis. And to do that, they injected sesame oil into their uterus. They all got endometritis. It was pretty effective. And then they ran them through their regular 6-month breeding program, okay? And they looked at the different responses in reproductive performance of those animals fed with or without OmniGen. I'm not going to share all the details because it's mice for one thing, but some of them are really interesting. What I've shared here, if you look at A and B, these are histological preparations of the uterus of these animals. And what you see here on these little red marks, those are red blood vessels. Those are blood vessels, okay, within this damaged uterus, endometrium, okay? And it's hard to see much of a difference as I look at these, because it's not much to see, but they use a counter to look at these different cell types. And what they saw was a significantly larger number of blood vessels within this uterine tissue compared when OmniGen was fed compared to when the control diet was fed, okay? So they had an increased vascularity of that damaged tissue when OmniGen was fed. That's really interesting. So when we look back at some of the work that was done in the Florida work, where they found that an impaired uterine environment was at least in part responsible for poor reproductive performance. In this study with mice, we found an improved uterine environment when OmniGen was fed. And actually, several other areas, I didn't share them all, but they saw less uterine disease, so less endometritis, better recovery from that endometritis. And then in those mice that were treated this way, we actually had improved fertility. They had more pups per litter, more babies, and more litters when OmniGen was fed. It's actually a really fascinating little study with mice. So we took that as a positive response. We have an improved uterine environment, and it led us to our next study in another animal model. And in this case, we used beef embryos. Okay, so we had a study that we sponsored at Oregon State University, which was also in the northwest corner of the U.S. And we had Angus cows on 4 different treatments, six animals per treatment diet. Okay, and these animals were put through a superovulation program. Okay, we're looking at embryos here. And so for that superovulation program, they were either injected with 200 milligrams of follicle stimulating hormone or 400 milligrams of follicle stimulating hormone. And then they were fed with a controlled diet or an OmniGen supplemented diet. So there's 4 treatments, 2 levels of FSH, 200 and 400, and 2 levels of OmniGen, 0 or approximately 55 grams per head per day, okay, with or without OmniGen. And the layout said it was a short study, 49 days. So they received their diets for 28 days prior to beginning the superovulation program. Then 15-day superovulation protocol was followed, and then they collected embryos 7 days after estrus. What they found was the number of degenerate embryos was reduced when OmniGen was fed, when either 200 or 400 milligrams of FSH were used. So degenerate embryos are dead. So they're collecting the embryos. Degenerate embryos are the dead embryos among those. So they didn't survive. So they wouldn't be useful at all. The number is a little bit different when you look at the percentage of dead embryos recovered. Here you really see where the difference comes. It's in this 400 milligram dose of FSH. You see a sharp reduction in dead embryos when OmniGen was fed compared to controls. Okay, this is fairly stressful. You get more embryos, but you get more dead embryos as well when 400 milligrams of FSH are used. But it really highlighted this response to feeding OmniGen. Our takeaway from this was that feeding OmniGen improved embryo production. In this case, actually embryo quality. There's less dead ones. The quality was improved. That's not good. Hang on, Jim. I'm going to run out of charge here. I don't know if you guys saw that. Okay. Crisis averted. So, what this did from these 2 studies, again, they're not so exciting to dairy nutritionists or dairy producers doing rat work or mouse work and doing work with embryos. But for us, it gave us confidence that, okay, OmniGen is having a really significant response in these animals. Now we're ready to make that big move and do a large dairy herd reproduction study, okay? And that's what we did. We sponsored a study conducted by the University of Florida on a large commercial dairy with about 1,500 mature cows, okay? These animals calved from August through April 2018 to 2019. And in this study, OmniGen was fed from 60 days prior to expected calving, so about dry off, through approximately 150 days in milk. It was a commercial dairy, so they managed their cows, as they would. So if animals were confirmed pregnant prior to 150 days in milk, they moved out of the study into another pen. About 700 animals per treatment group. So 700 animals received our dose of OmniGen. In the US, we use 56 grams. You guys are smarter over there. You round to 55 grams per cow per day. For a control group, we actually used AB20. Now, AB20 is a aluminosilicate. It's a clay, and it is sold by Fibro as a mycotoxin binder. And in field studies, will often use AB20 as a positive control or a placebo to compare with OmniGen to overcome a common objection that, hey, perhaps the ingredients in OmniGen are simply serving as a mycotoxin binder, and those responses are because you're binding mycotoxins. To overcome that objection, we actually use a mycotoxin binder in the control diet so that there's no concern that the responses are simply a binding activity, that the responses are related more to the immunological effects of OmniGen. So we're just going to look at the repro work here. This again is a survival curve. Unlike the previous one that I showed you, it's kind of flipped upside down. We're actually looking at the percentage of cows that are not pregnant through, in this case, 300 days in milk, okay, from this study. And here, the blue dashed line is going to be the results of the cows that were fed OmniGen, and the red dotted line is going to be results of the control cows, or the ones that were fed AB20. And certainly at the beginning of the study, they had a voluntary waiting period of 77 days. Nothing was bred, so nothing's pregnant. So 100% not pregnant. So from 77 to 84 days, at that first week when they were eligible, we had a sharp reduction in the percent not pregnant. And here's really where we see the most response to OmniGen, where we see a first service conception rate. It's not statistically significant different, where you see a 4 percentage unit reduction, 4.5 percentage unit reduction in first service conception rate when OmniGen was fed compared to AB20. Right? Second service conception rate, really not seeing much of a difference, but kind of what you see here is that initial improvement is maintained, where we have this percentage improvement in the animals that are pregnant when they're fed OmniGen. Right? Although we didn't get a statistically significant difference in conception rate, we did see in that study a really nice significant response in days open. Days open reduced by 10 days when OmniGen was fed compared to the control fed diet. For us in the US, we usually just use a standard number. Each day open is worth $3, so we just won't do the math on that, so it's $30 savings. But it's a significant response to move that days open back by 10 days is pretty significant. And again, days open, I'm not sure if we all use the same terminology, Jim. Days open is the period from calving through pregnancy.
Yes.
So, okay. So a really nice response, consistent with our expectations. I'll share that in this study, we didn't just look at reproduction, although that was a major finding for us, but they also found an improvement in milk production and less disease in those animals. And certainly we feel as if that reproductive performance is likely related to this reduction in disease incidence. And that would be consistent with some of the other work that's been done that I shared earlier. When we have fewer fresh cow diseases, reproductive performance tends to improve in dairy cattle. This seems consistent with that response. Okay, and that's all I had on the repro piece. Again, we haven't done a lot of controlled research, and it's very difficult to do field studies on reproduction because there's so many factors that impact reproductive performance. But we have a lot of confidence in the response in reproductive performance when OmniGen was fed. It's certainly consistent with the way the product works and the improvement in fresh cow health that we would see an improvement in reproduction. And this study helped to support that. And Jim, the last piece that I got to talk about is the impacts of OmniGen on mitigating heat stress. And this is a kind of a favorite of mine. And so I might get in the weeds a little bit on this one, and I'd be happy to if somebody wants to join me there. This is the time of year when we start talking about heat stress. It's February. I experienced a blizzard here in Wisconsin yesterday, and like I said, got delayed because of weather. So this is when we talk about heat stress, and sometimes it's hard to keep our mind on it, but heat stress is coming. It comes every year, and it has really significant impacts on animal performance for sure. I wanted to go through some of that. Just a reminder, and I have to remind myself, like I said, when it's cold out, I live in the northern half of the US, and we don't often think that it gets very hot. And most dairy farmers don't think it gets that hot because we're not hot. We're not sweating all the time. We got to remember that dairy cattle experience heat stress at a much lower temperature and humidity, because they both involve temperature and humidity than humans do. We know from research work that dairy cattle, lactating dairy cows, will express heat stress when the temperature and humidity index, it's a calculation, it's not a challenging calculation, but I like to use a spreadsheet for it. When the temperature humidity index meets or exceeds 68. Well, what's temperature humidity index? What's that mean? Well, actually, these dials show where that occurs, and they're in centigrade, so these are EU friendly. So when the temperature is 21 degrees centigrade and the relative humidity is approximately 54%, that's when you hit a THI of 68. Okay. Now there's different temperatures and humidity to reach that 68. And many of you have probably seen graphs like this or charts like this that show that. Jim, I look at, for us in the summertime, what I would consider a pleasant day in the summer in Pennsylvania where I live. And that's going to be about 80 degrees, 50% humidity. That's a pretty nice day in the summer. For you, that'd be 26.5 degrees centigrade. It's probably not that bad.
Yes.
So 80 degrees, 50% humidity, that's a THI of 73. I'm comfortable. I'm thinking it's pretty nice. These cows are hot. So I think that's one thing we need to keep in mind when we consider heat stress for dairy cattle. It hits them a lot earlier than we recognize in many cases. So these little charts are kind of handy to have around. So in regard to OmniGen, we've done a lot of research with OmniGen in heat stress dairy cows. Just a couple of examples here of what we've looked at. Research that was conducted at University of Arizona and University of Florida, both two organizations that have done a tremendous amount of work in heat stress, different kinds of heat stress in Arizona, which is a desert climate, with Florida, which is like a swamp, a hot swamp. But in both cases, when OmniGen was fed, respiration rates were reduced by, on average, about 10%. Okay, so a measurable response in respiration rate. And I'm sorry I didn't mention, cows express heat stress by panting. They use that to cool themselves off, and we can use that as a way to monitor whether or not cows are experiencing heat stress. And when the THI hits 68, they'll breathe at the rate of 60 breaths per minute. It's recognizable. They'll be breathing pretty heavy, and that'll go up to well over 100 breaths per minute in really hot cows. So it's something that's easily measured and recognizable as you work on these dairies. University of Arizona also showed they were measuring water intake in that study, and I'm sorry I got gallons here. Those animals consume 3 less gallons per day. So certainly when cows are hot, they're sweating more, they're panting more. Be honest, they're urinating more. They tend to drink and urinate to try and get that hot water out of their body. There's a lot of water turnover. Cows that are cooler will drink less, and that's what they found in the University of Arizona study. So it's interesting. And there's other work that's been done. This is some work that was conducted in Brazil. And really, any research project you do in Brazil is a heat stress study. It's pretty hot. And in this case, they used thermocrons. So indwelling vaginal thermocrons, where they mounted this hobo thermometer that automatically recorded temperature on a CEDAR. And so they implanted the CEDAR into the vagina, and they took vaginal temperatures on a regular basis. And here they show average temperature over the study. And in this case, OmniGen was fed beginning at 35 days prior to expected calving through, I think it's 48 days. I got another slide that'll show it. But the average temperature was really not that different, right? From 39 to 38.8 when OmniGen was fed. But one thing to keep in mind, this 39 degrees centigrade is like I'm going to say magic number. That's not the right word to use, but it's a very significant number when it comes to heat stress. Above that temperature is where embryos die, okay? So within a cow. So it really has a strong impact on reproduction. But this is often used as a threshold of heat stress. When temperature exceeds 39, when it reaches 39.1, that's an animal that's experiencing heat stress. So what's interesting to me is these following results here. The hours in which animals had a body temperature greater than or equal to 39.1, 20 hours in the control-fed animals, 10 hours in the OmniGen-fed animals. When you look at it as a percentage, half the time, okay? This is fascinating to me. Animals that were experiencing the same environmental conditions, when they were fed OmniGen, experienced heat stress half the amount of time compared to the control-fed animals. That's a really exciting result, right? That's a demonstrable result. You can see that difference in these animals. I think we've had a number of folks that will say that the behavior changes in these animals, and that's understandable. They're experiencing heat stress half as much as animals that were not receiving OmniGen. To me, it's fascinating. From that same study, this is a milk yield response. Again, they started feeding 35 days prior to calving, took it out through about 45 days. Not surprisingly, milk yield was improved, likely related to the reduction in heat stress in those animals that received OmniGen. I'm doing okay on time, I think. Jim, I wanted to share with you guys something that interests people here in the U.S. quite a bit, and I'm assuming to be of interest to you guys as well. And that's the benefits of cooling dry cows. Now, I think most people recognize that it's important to have some type of cooling for lactating cows, whether you're cooling them in a holding pen, or you're putting fans on them in a barn, or ideally you're actually putting sprinklers on animals to cool them off. But there's been work that's been done primarily at the University of Florida by Dr. Jeff Dahl, a well-known researcher in this area, to show that the long-term and significant benefits of cooling cows during the dry period. So significant. So I just want to describe, this is the research barn that this work has been done on. It's a pretty simple setup. It's a open sidewall barn. It's got 2 rows of sand-bedded free stalls with fans. Okay, and then at the feed line, they'll have what they call soakers, I call sprinklers. So they're wetting the cows at the feed line. So you'll see a line of cows here. They're likely not up there eating. They're probably up there getting cool. Okay, they'll get wet, get cool, and then they'll go lie down in the fan-bedded free stalls. The fans will be blowing on them, and they'll be cooled off. It's very effective. Good cooling system that they have in many parts of Florida, which is a very humid environment. You may see here a gate. So the way they do their research here is half the barn has the fans and sprinklers on, and the other half has them off. These animals are cooled. The animals in the back are heat stressed. It's a simple system, okay? And that's the way they've done a lot of research over the years at the University of Florida. It's fascinating work. This shows the results in cows that are heat stressed during the dry period, okay? Let me describe this for you. So this is milk production in kilograms over the first 40 weeks of milk, so through pretty much the entire lactation. Animals were cooled throughout this period. The only time these animals were heat stressed would be in this dry period prior to calving, okay? They were either heat stressed or cooled. HT is heat stressed, CL is cooled. What you see is that animals that were heat stressed during the dry period only, and their dry period is 45 to 60 days, they tend to use a short dry period, they produce 5 kilograms per day less milk than animals that were cooled during the dry period. All these animals are cooled here. This is a result of dry period cooling, okay? 5 kilograms more milk per cow per day when they're cooled in the dry period. It has a really significant impact on performance. But it's not just the cow that benefits from cooling in late gestation or during the dry period. It's also the calf that's developing within that cow. We know that that calf has multiple physiological systems that are impacted by in utero heat stress late in its development. And those are listed here, okay? It includes lactation. So these results that are shown on this graph, again, milk production over this first 35 weeks after calving, are the results from heifers that were born to cows that were either heat stressed in late gestation or during the dry period, or cooled during the dry period. 2 years later, this is the response of heifers. Now, the heifers were cooled. They were grown identically the same. Those heifers are born a little bit earlier, so they're a little bit smaller at birth because when they're heat stressed. They actually stay a little bit smaller all the way through weaning. But by the time they're bred, and certainly by the time that they calve themselves, 2 years later, there's been compensatory gain. They've caught up. So they're not small heifers that are making less milk. These heifers are the same size, but they're making 5 kilograms less milk in their first lactation compared to animals that were born to cows that were cooled during that dry period. So this has long-term impacts on the performance of these heifers. I'm not going to share all the results here, but it's not just in first lactation. This has been shown to continue on to second and third lactation as well, okay? And the heifers out of cows that are heat stressed in the dry period have poorer survivability. Fewer of them make it to the third lactation if they were heat stressed in utero. So it's fascinating. But there's more, okay? It doesn't stop, right? It's not just the cow. We know it impacts the cow. It reduces their subsequent milk yield. We know it impacts the production of that heifer calf 2 years later when she comes into milk, but it also impacts the germ cells. The developing eggs within that fetus are also impacted by heat stress that she's experiencing in utero. So it has a multi-generational exposure to heat stress. So it's impacting the granddaughters, okay? And there's research to show that it may also be a genetic response. So this is going to be for all future generations. They have what they call DNA methylation. It's actually turning off some of the genes when these animals are experiencing heat stress. Just one quick graph here. These are the results in milk yield from granddaughters of cows that were heat stressed in the dry period or cooled in the dry period. Okay, so this is 2 generations down the road. And here you see those granddaughters coming out of heifers that were heat stressed in utero. I have to kind of think about it because it goes back so many generations. They're producing less milk in their first lactation, 2 generations from when the heat stress actually took place. So this cooling of dry cows is of tremendous interest to folks here in the United States, okay? Because the impacts can be not just for that cow in her subsequent lactation, it can be for her heifer calf 2 years later, and then for the granddaughters, and maybe for the entire herd for generations to come. So there's a lot of interest in this, and there's more and more work being done in this area. I bring it up for a number of reasons. Number one, it's kind of interesting to talk about, but we've also done research with OmniGen, with Dr. Dahl at the University of Florida that we think is really interesting. I told you about the design of this barn and how they use it to do heat stress, dry period heat stress work. What I didn't mention is at the feed line, they have individual feeders, and they're kind of like computer feeders. They're Kaylin gates. They wear a magnetic necklace, and each cow has that necklace. Only one spot will open up for her. So you can feed different diets within each of these pens. So what University of Florida did with OmniGen, whether they were cooled or heat stressed, cows received OmniGen or no OmniGen throughout that period, okay? So in this particular study, I'm going to share the results. We fed OmniGen, they fed OmniGen beginning 45 days prior to dry off, through the dry period, and all the way through 6 weeks in milk, okay? So they've received OmniGen throughout. But the treatments are going to be cooled or heat stressed with or without OmniGen, okay? Here's the results, and it's really interesting. Kind of hard to read. Here's milk production here on the y-axis, weeks in milk on the x-axis. I said 6 weeks. I meant to say 9 weeks. Kind of hard to see the response there, but if you look at the bar graph, which takes average daily milk yield for the the cooled fed OmniGen, cooled without OmniGen, heat stressed with OmniGen, heat stressed without OmniGen. Fascinating results. Again, heat stress reduced milk yield in that subsequent lactation by 5 kilograms when you compared cooled versus heat stressed. But when they fed OmniGen to those heat stressed cows, again, heat stressed only in the dry period, feeding OmniGen, they had the same response in milk yield as animals that were cooled during the dry period. Just a really fascinating response. So feeding OmniGen overcame the negative impacts of dry period heat stress in this study. Okay, so really, really strong response. Okay, so as we look at herds, it certainly in my part of the country, there's a fair number of smaller herds. They really have difficulty implementing a cooling system for their dry cows. And in that case, until they're able to implement a cooling system, we strongly believe in cooling dry cows and lactating cows. But until they can get a cooling system for their dry cows, we strongly recommend feeding OmniGen to those cows to help overcome the negative impact of heat stress in the dry period. And that I don't include all the results here. We know from this same study they tracked the calves coming out. The calves had a lower body temperature at birth, significantly lower when they were fed OmniGen compared to not OmniGen and experiencing heat stress in that dry period. Now, people have asked us, Jim, where's that coming from? How's that happen? This is an interesting study, the depth of work that they did here. They actually took mammary biopsies throughout this study, through the dry period. So they actually went into the mammary gland, got a sample of mammary tissue. And one of the things that they found was that in looking at proliferation of cells, mammary epithelial cells, that's the growth and the development of the mammary epithelium, the milk-producing cells, you can see this graph, this chart, mirrors the milk yield chart that I just showed you. So feeding OmniGen to heat-stressed dry cows increased the number of mammary epithelial cells, milk-producing cells, compared to those animals that are heat-stressed and not fed OmniGen. It's just the response is similar to cooling. They actually had more milk-producing cells simply by feeding OmniGen. To me, it's a fascinating response. Now, the next question that most people ask, well, how's that happen? We just keep peeling back the onion. We don't know yet. There's more in-depth work, more analyses that are being done of a number of different samples that were taken and measurements that were taken to further understand how OmniGen can bring about such a significant response. But the fact is, feeding OmniGen to heat-stressed dry cows brings about a similar response as cooling those dry cows. Really critical for those guys that are unable to cool their dry cows. So, Jim, thanks for letting me chat a little bit about some of the work that we've done with OmniGen in these three areas. Seeing the benefits of less mastitis, fewer days open, and heat stress.
Yeah, I find it really interesting, especially the heat stress part at the end of it. Coming from a country where we don't actually think we get so much heat stress, it just makes you realise that if it's high humidity, it doesn't have to be high Celsius. It could be 21, 22 degrees, and it still makes the cows prone to having heat stress.
Yep.
But here's a return on investment on technically for every pound you spend, how much money do you get back. So these are based on 2018, 2019 figures, and I've converted them back to pounds. Naturally, the euros slightly higher. So it just shows you the cost in 2019 in the UK. It was £244 per cow, which is for the mastitis cases. Reduced open days between £2 and £5, depending on the farm. But again, if you go back, you were saying it's like £5 per cow. If you're saving 10 open days, you're saving yourself £50, and through a head that goes into your hundreds of thousands of pounds. And then you have your heat stress per cow, works out about 227. That's based on information from the Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Sorry if I didn't pronounce that right. Again, it's all very interesting information. One day. Okay. And again, this is your return on investment. So if you look at your increased milk production, this is based on 27 pence, which was probably 2 or 3 years ago. I think most places are sitting in the high 40s or early 50s, either pence or cents. So an extra 7 grams of milk per day, and it works out at 28 euros. Going back to 2019, it's probably worth double that now. Improved health benefits, again, lower mastitis cases, saving £11.50 per head. And then your stronger reproductive performance, just what we spoke about. It's an extra open day, as in 10 days, it's €2.47, which works out, but over a 10-day period, it works out to later £24. Because if you see that it's a £5, if it's a farm, it's costing £5, it works out about £50. Hope that makes sense. Keys to success. It's quite simple. You feed the cows 55 grams per cow per day. Effectively, we want you to feed all the cows, but you can do it in different sections. The duration, the ramp-up period is about 45 to 60 days before you really get the full response. And we in the EU would try and make sure that you're feeding them for 6 months, and it gives you the actual good results. The data, we record all the health data, cell counts, milk production, and anything else like vet bills, etc. We have a look at that as well. on that, guys. That's the presentation finished. I'll open up to Q&A. I've already got some questions. I've got one here from, is it Ryan, in Ireland? And he's asking, what is the actual active ingredients within OmniGen, Dave?
Okay, that's a great question. You know, folks who have heard the OmniGen story in the past might have asked this themselves. And several years ago, we didn't answer it. We didn't answer it well, for sure. But we've changed that, and we now openly share the active ingredients in OmniGen. There's three of the components that are included in OmniGen. One of those is silicon dioxide, specifically, at least in the U.S., that's diatomaceous earth. Another is aluminosilicates, which is clay, a type of clay, very specific clay. And third is yeast cell wall. And those are very common ingredients. Many folks could find those same names on feed mills probably anywhere in the world. What's unique about OmniGen, though, is our criteria that we use to select the specific ingredients that are included in the product. And we actually have developed a rodent bioassay model, and I'll describe it real quick. We simply feed these, it's mice. We feed these mice a diet with OmniGen, the current OmniGen as it's formulated today, and then we'll substitute a single ingredient. It may be the silicon dioxide source, it may be the yeast cell wall material, and then we'll just substitute the one source into that diet, and then we'll feed that for, I think it's 14 days, and then we'll sacrifice the mice and take blood samples from those animals. It's hard to bleed a mouse, so you have to sacrifice them to get the blood. And then we'll actually run that through a panel of immune measures that we've established. It's a proprietary bioassay that we've used, and we'll consider those sources that will either meet or exceed those measures of immune function. So we use that to maintain the quality of our product. So we're always going to have a consistent response, and that you can have an expectation that you're going to have that immunological response. Yeast cell wall is not yeast cell wall. Silicon dioxide is not silicon dioxide. Every one of those three components will have an impact on our measures of immunity. So we use that both for internal quality control and to look to make improvements in the product over time.
Another question. It's from Michael in the UK. I think it's Scotland. How does it actually work in the immune system? How does OmniGen actually work when you feed it to the cows? What's the mode of action?
Okay, so this is something we're continually investigating. What we know so far from both very basic studies and more practical work is when we feed OmniGen, those key components, those active ingredients in OmniGen actually come into contact with immune cells that line the digestive tract. And maybe folks have heard there's more and more interest on gut health and more knowledge of how the immune system is integrated into the digestive system. Some people will say the digestive tract is the largest immune organ. It's lined with many immune cells. So when we feed OmniGen, those components of OmniGen come into contact with those immune cells, and they activate these cells and initiate a cascade of immunological activities that results in really two things. One, and the term we use is that it works to maintain immune competence. And I think some people now become familiar with that term because with COVID, we all kind of know a little bit more about the immune system. Immune competence is that you have the appropriate response to a challenge. Many of you probably know that, you know, when COVID hit, it wasn't necessarily the virus that was so deadly. It was the immune system's response to that virus, the inflammation, the out of control response. Immune competence means that you don't have an out of control response. You have an appropriate response to fight off an invader without this overwhelming inflammatory response. And the other is we modify the stress response. So I didn't share on any of these slides. We've done a lot with certainly the heat stress work in looking at cortisol. I think most folks recognize cortisol is the stress hormone. When we have an acute stress, a sudden stress, we get a big spike in cortisol. Sometimes over time, we have a reduction in cortisol. What we found when OmniGen is fed, it modifies that response. It moderates the response. So we have an altered stress response. The cortisol response is altered. So we really feel that that's a basic part of the mechanism of action of OmniGen, the combination of the two, an altered stress response and that maintenance of immune competence.
One from Paul. Is there any benefits, including OmniGen and calf milk powder? I think by that is just being calf's immune system's zero. It's just to see what benefits of giving OmniGen and milk powder. And I'd also say, like, basically calf pellets. What would be the benefit of
it? We've done some work with milk-fed calves in the past, and we have seen benefits: reduce scours, reduce respiratory disease. The challenge in milk-fed calves is the delivery system. I think that's what you were saying, Jim. Was a little scratchy. It doesn't stay in suspension in many cases. So as you look at feeding calves, OmniGen, perhaps one way to look at doing that is actually put it into a pelleted starter feed or transition feed. I think there's some great opportunities in that area. We've done a little bit of work, but not a lot. A lot of our research is focused on the lactating cows and dry cows.
Okay. One from Philip in Ireland. So I can probably relate to being from Scotland, saying that heat stress isn't really a big issue in Ireland. But is there any studies, data on cold stress?
So I think, okay, this is like a pet project of mine, because I'm not sure that cold stress actually exists. I know people would criticize me for that, but stress, as we look at a cortisol response, has never really been shown with cold. But we know that cold impacts the animals. A lot of times they don't get to eat. Could be because their waters are frozen. And certainly feed deprivation is a stressor that has impacts. But I guess I need to answer honestly that we have not looked at this in regard to OmniGen. But you just heard I just denied cold stress even exists. But there are other stressors that probably related to the cold weather that have an impact on the cow.
I think what Philip's meaning by that is it's like in Ireland, there's some sort of New Zealand style farming where the cows are kept out all year round, in all periods. So it's like but even like during the dry period for the cow, and they're sitting or standing or sitting or lying in wind and rain. With OmniGen help.
I think any time the cow is uncomfortable, there's probably an opportunity for her to experience stress, and we've seen that in all types of stressors that there would be a benefit to feeding OmniGen because of the mechanism of action that it alters that stress response. It actually tends to reduce stress. We got to be careful when we say that sometimes. That's a strong statement, but as we've measured it, we reduce stress. So anything that would be stressful would likely see a benefit from feeding OmniGen.
Yeah. I've got one here from an anonymous attendee. Read this out. Research shows that there is no significant difference between cooled and OmniGen fed cows in milk production or respiration rates. Should we put OmniGen on if we use it for heat stress, if we have good ventilation?
And by ventilation, I guess they mean like fans, airflow?
Yeah, if you've got cows that are actually cooled and they're cooled very effectively, would it be beneficial for the cow to also have OmniGen put through the diet?
Yeah, so I think, again, OmniGen provides benefits not just related to heat stress. So if you effectively cool the cows, you can still see benefits from feeding OmniGen whenever stress is present. So we know there's stress present at calving, there's stress present at dry off, there's stress related to, like I said, feed deprivation. There's stress related to the presence of molds and mycotoxins that create immunological stress in the animals. So there will be benefits. As you consider whether animals are effectively cooled with fans, and you can have good airflow, but still have hot cows, certainly by us, because you're blowing hot air across a hot cow, you haven't really cooled the cow in some cases. a good measure of whether or not that animal is experiencing stress is that respiration rate, breaths per minute. Simple to measure, 60 breaths per minute. That animal is heat stressed. That's a good way to evaluate a cooling system. And certainly those animals would benefit from feeding OmniGen.
I think that's the questions done now. Has anybody else got any more questions? Even if you send them after this presentation's finished, but we're finishing it, we'll reply by email. So if there's no other questions, I don't think there is. Hopefully, everybody's seen the benefits of this webinar. It's helped you understand how OmniGen works and how it can benefit your dairy herds. If anybody has any questions or would like to look at using OmniGen on your farms, or like a DCP, a distributor on your farms, if you contact us through the website, or if you know your local salesperson, your local nutritionist, your local dairy technical specialist for your country, even just give them a shout and they'll come and visit you and we'll chat about it. But I'd like to thank everybody very much and have a good evening, folks.
Thank you, folks.